Okay, this is the 1st of November, and class is normally scheduled for tomorrow at 10 o'clock, but I have a doctor's appointment, so this video is going to substitute for our live session on Tuesday, November 2nd. So no class on Tuesday, November 2nd. This video will substitute for the lecture that I would have given on the 2nd. All right, we have finished our discussion of Mod 38. So this is a beginning of our discussion on Mod 39. And then we'll pick up whatever questions you have on Thursday about 38 and 39. And then, of course, we'll have the exam over the weekend. So what are we talking about in Mod 39? It's mostly a description of trait theory and other little issues that involve personality. So let's start with a discussion of traits. And we have a definition of traits. Matter of fact, it's the very first question on your study guide. Which approach to personality focuses on describing individual differences? Obviously, the trait perspective. And question 4 is actually the definition. A characteristic, pattern, or behavior or tendency to act and feel in a certain way is called a trait. So traits are little parts that are grouped together in clusters, and those clusters define our personality. So in the beginning, we had Gordon Allport, who is the psychologist who legend says that he gave his one of his PhD graduate students a dictionary about that thick and had him go through and find every adjective in the dictionary describing somebody's personality. So things like kind or attentive or boisterous or shy and quiet, all those things, and whittled them down to, I don't know, about 30,000 different adjectives. And then he finally came up with 4,500 terms describing personality. And of course, that's not particularly workable. So along comes Raymond Cattell in, I believe in the 1950s. And he boiled down those 4,500 terms into 16 terms that he thought would cover all the significant aspects of describing a personality. And when I say 16, just like in a minute, I'll be talking about the big 5, you'll remember that so many things in psychology are on a continuum. So when you say, let's take a big 5 trait factor like agreeableness, and we can define agreeableness, and then there's the opposite of agreeableness. So on the spectrum, one side is going to be agreeable and the other end is going to be not agreeable or hostile, and most of us, of course, are somewhere in between. That shouldn't be a surprise to you. So even though we say it's the 16 PF, which the PF stands for personality factors, that's the name that Cattell gave his personality questionnaire inventory. It really is, 32. So because you're looking at one end of the spectrum being the one that's mentioned, but then because the way it works, the other side is also there, the opposite. So it's basically 16, or in the big five, 5, and it includes the opposites. So, all right. Now, in your book, there's a little discussion about the iSync husband and wife team, Hans and Sybil. I left that out of the study guide on purpose because there's so many questions. I felt like that was a good group to cut out. The only thing that I think that is important about the iSyncs is they mentioned that extroversion, that introversion versus extroversion in the big 5, or the emotionality factors, which is neuroticism, those 2 factors seem to have be influenced greatly by your genetics. So we know that our personality is created by an interaction between our bio, our psycho, and our social. Those 3 triangles, 3 points of the triangle, they're all interacting with each other. We know that. A good example is temperament. Temperament is the way we sort of handle the world. And children, for instance, you may have heard of children that have a problem with their digestive system in the first months of life, because of maybe some immaturity at the time that they were born, and they're very finicky, colicky is the word they use, and this causes great stress for the child because they feel sick all the time, and it creates even more stress, I suppose, or equal amount of stress among their caretakers, because we're programmed to respond to crying children, because that's an evolutionary way that we would take, as adults, we would take care of a child if they were crying. And with colicky kids, there's nothing you can do to console them. We don't have any magic medicine, magic elixir. You can hug them and love on them, and everything that you would normally do to a kid that was sick or not feeling well, and it doesn't work. And that becomes very, very frustrating as a caretaker, because the child is literally crying every waking moment, and then they don't really generally sleep very well either. So even the best of mother or fathers, everybody gets tired of listening to a crying kid for hours at a time, days at a time, weeks at a time. And it sets up a dangerous interaction between the caretakers and the child. The child is not feeling well. They don't view the world as a nice, warm, loving place. They view it as a nasty, hostile place, and their parents are not getting any enjoyment out of being parents. The kid isn't getting any enjoyment out of being alive, and it's horrible. And that starts, or it can start, a pattern of behavior where this kid is treated different than other kids. Some of you have brothers and sisters. You may say to yourself, well, I know who mom treated the best, or dad liked the most, or something like that. And that may or may not be true. But if you sit back and think about it, especially when you're doing some self-introspection, looking at yourself, say, why did my mom prefer my brother or my sister over me. And if you're truthful to yourself, you can look at your own personality and your own way of reacting and say that what we obviously know, that this dance that we've talked about in attachment theory, that this dance between the child and the adult caretakers goes more smoothly when there's not emotional or physical problems that are the genesis of emotional relationship problems that occur. So finicky babies, crying babies, upset babies, people have a hard time being around them. If you have 3 kids and 2 of your kids are very nice and get along and listen to instructions, and then one kid is always not listening, always getting in trouble, and you need to go somewhere and need a babysitter, you might have one of your family members tell you, well, take these 2 kids, but the younger one, you're going to find somebody else to deal with them, because it's a give and go situation. That biopsychosocial is not only you, but everybody else that you involve yourself with. So if you're a behavioral disordered type child, for whatever reason, you are going to be less liked by your relatives and people less willing to come in and help you, because it's difficult being around you. So there are other biological things. The authors talk about dopamine and dopamine-related neural activities. You know, dopamine is a neurotransmitter. We've talked about it being associated with schizophrenia, but there's other things that dopamine are involved with, including this openness and this extroversion part of yourself. So some of the parts of the big 5 can also have some biological relationships. Actually, they all do. It's just easier to see when we're talking about that. So that's mentioned in the book. All right, we talked a little bit last week about the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is now in its 2nd iteration, and the 3rd one is, I guess, in beta testing or something. So it used to be called just the MMPI, then it was called the MMPI 2, and now we have the MMPI 3. Under study, I guess. So I wanted to explain again about the way the MMPI was designed. What they essentially did was the psychologists from the University of Minnesota psychology department took a bunch of questions and they went to certain groups of people who were already diagnosed with mental illness. And so they gave them this test, which is a true-false test. It just asks a question. Are you generally happy? Yes, true or false? And what's I think is important for you to understand is the content of the question doesn't have to be true, and it's not very meaningful. The content is not meaningful to you as a psychologist or somebody looking at the results of the test. Because the question might be, I would rather be a librarian than a farmer. What? What does that mean? Well, the content, clearly you understand the content. I would rather be a librarian than a farmer. It doesn't matter whether that's true or not. And the content is not important. What's important is the person who took that test, or should I say, the group of people who were schizophrenic, who were neurotic, who were depressed. They took that question, and let's say you're neurotic. The neurotics seem to always answer that question true. Other groups, sometimes true, sometimes false. It's not very indicative of which group you're in. So here's a question in the book. My hands and feet are usually warm enough. What's true or false? All right, true for you. Now, does that make you more neurotic? Does it make you more psychotic? What do we got? This question may seem superficial, but it just so happens that anxious people, the people who score high on neuroticism, were more likely to say false. Well, if you're neurotic, you're always concerned about your physical health and ailments. And so since most of us wear socks when we're cold on our feet, and when we're warm, then maybe we wear sandals and we don't have socks. So we keep that homeostatic level of comfort. But with a neurotic, it doesn't really matter. It's what you think it is. It's not really what it is. It's what you think it is. So those people who are neurotics seem to consistently answer that question false. And so the MMPI's got a lot of questions, 400 and 600, depending on whether you take the long version or the not so short version. It takes a while to answer, and you're encouraged to answer quickly. Don't put a lot of thought into it. Don't overthink it. Are your feet normally warm? Yeah, all right, yeah, okay, move on. So every one of the personality factors that we're looking at, including the male-female, which is not really a personality factor, but it is one of the scales that we look at on the MMPI. You can be pushed in one direction more than the other direction because everything's on a spectrum. So you can be more neurotic or less neurotic. So how neurotic do you have to be graded on the MMPI as high on neuroticism? Well, 80 questions have to do with pushing you in the direction, all of them, all of the traits. So if you wanted to get a perfect neuroticism, a perfect depressed, a perfect psychopathic deviant, you would answer every one of those 80 questions in that direction. So most people don't do that, of course. But if you get over 65, then that's considered clinically significant. So these questions that you're answering, the content doesn't matter. What matters is, what did the schizophrenics or the psychopathic deviants have to say about, I like the color blue more than green? So the content's not important. So it's empirical. It doesn't even have to be true. One of the questions they talk about, well, actually it's in your study guide. It was asking you what question would be like likely to be on the MMPI? Of course, I probably can't find it right now. Well, we're going to go through some of these questions near the end of the class anyway, so we'll come upon it. Okay. So we started off in trade theory with this 4,500 trades. Raymond Cattell boiled it down to 16, and then a couple of more contemporary psychologists boiled it down to the big 5. So the 16 PF is still a personality inventory that psychologists use, and the big 5 is also used. The MMPI, I think I mentioned to you last week, I'll reiterate it, that the MMPI is the most frequently used personality examination of any personality test. It's used worldwide, and it's been interpreted to a lot of languages. It's been researched more than any other personality assessment tool. Okay, the author brings in sort of Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory of psychology as to how it affects your personality development. And that's a little bit about what I was just saying with the finicky, colicky kids. Because of their problems, because of their temperament, they reflect or they interact with other humans, other adults, and because of their disposition, adults are responding to them in certain ways. So it is always a give and take situation. Whether it's a good give and take or a bad give and take, it's always an interactive. That's part of the social side. You, the composite of biopsychosocial, your social side is all the relationships that you have. And the book talks about this reciprocal determinism, which is another issue I left off the study guide. And really all it means is if how I act and how I feel can affect other people who interact with me. So if I'm very, very negative, other people are going to respond to that, and it's usually not in a positive way. So the fact, and this is where childhood development gets to be tricky, because if your kid starts off being a finicky kid, adults don't give them as much love and attention that they would another child who was less bothersome. And then when these kids start interacting with their peers, the peers do the same thing. Nobody likes to be playing with toys, and a kid is always grabbing them and taking from you, or whining and crying. And, you know, kids are, sure, they're different than adults, but they get aggravated with those kind of behaviors too. So then what happens is the peers move away from a kid that's has this kind of bad start with their personality, and that affects them. So they don't mature, they don't learn mutual playing, they don't learn how to share. Maybe their language is a little bit behind because they're not trying to learn to converse with their friends because they don't have any friends. Nobody wants to be around them. So it is a give and take situation, as I mentioned to you earlier about doing a self-assessment and asking yourself in a realistic way, did my parents treat me the way I was, which you may think was better or worse than a sibling based on how I acted. If I was more positive, if I was more optimistic, and I was more responsive to them asking for help or whatever, then likewise they return nice behaviors and good things for me. And that's this reciprocal determinism that Bandura was talking about. That's social psychology. It shouldn't surprise you at all. We looked at social psychology when it came to the Milgram shocking experience and the Stanford Prison Project with Philip Zimbardo. So you know that there's always this situational influence on us, internal orientation, and how we respond to the situation around us. So that's like the psychological side of the biopsychosocial interacting with the social side. There's a good descriptive table in here. I don't even see a page number, so it would be 485 in the hard copy. I don't know what it would be on your digital copy, but it's a nice orange, which is my favorite color, so maybe I'm influenced by that. Diagram discussing personality theory, psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, which again, I don't see the big difference between those two, but humanistic trait and social cognitive. And in the key proponents who thought it up, obviously with psychoanalytical was Freud, and then the neo-Freudians, Adler, Karen Horney, and Jung were his understudies, and then they sort of went off in their own direction. Anyway, key proponents, assumptions, view of how personality is created, and then how personality should be assessed. So that's a pretty good, maybe I'll try to scan that and put it on Blackboard for you, but it is in your book. Okay, now getting back to social psychology, the chapter mentions things about like the spotlight effect, where there's a certain time in your life where you think, especially adolescents, you think the world is looking at you and it's all about you. And if you walk into a room and they got this young lady with a Barry Manilow picture on her t-shirt walking in the room, and she's, I don't know. But it is usually with adolescents that they think that the world is always looking at them, and how they act and how they do their hair or how their makeup is and all that kind of stuff is going to just have this profound effect on the social characters in their life, and maybe closer knit friends, but not so much everybody else. And it's a maturational thing. They tend to grow out of it. Also mentioned is this concept of self-serving bias, a readiness to perceive others favorably. People accept more responsibility for good deeds than for bad, and for successes than failures. So we sort of protect ourselves when we do our self-serving bias. Just like when we talk about ourselves today, we generally talk about ourselves in more pleasant and incompetent ways than when we look at ourselves in the past, because the past is over, we can't change it. And today we are what we are. And so we don't want to be dissing ourselves today, but if we look at ourselves in the past, we might say, yeah, I should have learned from that, or I was kind of immature back then, something like that. However, most of us see ourselves as better than average, which is a testament to our self-esteem. If we have a good self-esteem, we think that we are better than others, not in a degrading way on them, but that we are positive and we stand out. It's not just being average. The C student, C, of course, is a grade for a average student. Most of us say, no, not in my life. A is average for me. B is average for me. C is a failure to me. I don't want to be a C student. And you're not going to be able to console a friend who made a C on a test by saying, well, that's average. That's what, no, it's not going to work that way. There's a concept called narcissism. Seems like I was talking about narcissism with our friend in California, Elliot Rogers, but I don't know why I've thought we've spoken about him. We will speak about him when we get into mental disorders for sure. But narcissism is this idea that we're sort of in love with ourselves. And like I always say, we're on a spectrum, and some narcissism is good because we look at ourselves positively. We want to take care of ourselves. We think that we're capable of handling new challenges and stuff. That's sort of narcissistic personality a little bit. And it's a positive thing. Of course, there's negative sides of narcissism. When you don't accept responsibility for anything, everything wrong is everybody else's problem and not yours. 80 studies have replicated the dangerous effect of narcissism, excessive self-love and self-focus. On aggression, researchers have concluded that conceited, self-important individuals turn nasty towards those who puncture their bubbles of self-love, so says Baumeister in 2001. So in the case of Elliot Rogers, he took narcissism to a level I've never ever heard of, because he became a destructive, murdering person because of his extreme narcissism. Now, the author kind of switched gears here and starts talking about collectivist societies versus individualistic societies. This is a theme that I know we have talked about the first 10 weeks of this class, and we'll probably talk about it again, because we in the Western world here are individualist. We look at things a lot differently than people in a collectivist society. There's another great table on page 491, which separates the difference between individualism and collectivism. So let me review that just because it's a good review of those concepts. Okay, on the idea of self, individualism looks at us, we look at ourselves as independent, and we identify with our individual traits. The collective person from a collectivist society looks at themselves as an interdependent person. Their identity comes from their membership in a group, their family, their neighborhood, their city, and their country. All those things help define them. And they see themselves more as a component in this mosaic of their country, as opposed to us. We are individuals in the mosaic, where they are part of the mosaic. Life task. Our life task is to discover and express our own uniqueness. Value your uniqueness. That's a big emphasis in our society. Be you. You be you, I'll be me, and that's the way it's going to be. Collectivist society says, hey, you maintain your connections, your group identity. That's what's important. Remember your heritage, remember where you were born, remember, you're the part of the groups that you are part of that helps define you. What matters? Individualism? Me, of course. Personal achievement and fulfillment, rights and liberties, self-esteem. Go west, young man, and cut out a new world for yourself. Collectivism, of course, us. Groups and their solidarity, being one with the group, social responsibilities and relationships, and your duty and commitment to family. Having me being involved with somebody in the Philippines, I get to live this every day because the two cultures are radically different when it comes to what matters. Coping with in individualism, change reality. If you don't like your reality, change it. You're responsible for your own happiness. Cut your own pathway. Collectivism, you accommodate to reality. This is the way it is. This is the way my parents were, grandparents, my neighbors. So I'm down for it. It's all about community and family. Morality defined by the individual. That's kind of dangerous because that's relative morality, relative to how I feel today or how I might feel tomorrow. And with the collectivism, it's defined by social networks, duty-based, well-defined, understood. Now, it's not hardcore. It's not that we can't do some of both, but we're talking about in large generalities. Relationships. Individualist, we have many relationships, often temporary or casual, and confrontation is certainly acceptable in our relationships. Conflict and strife. On the collectivism, they have few close relationships. There are few relationships, but they're close and they're enduring. Harmony is what's important. So they do have relationships, and they're good, close relationships, but they don't have the selection of types of relationships like we do in our individualistic society here. And then finally, attributing behavior. This we did talk about in our other part of social psychology. Behavior reflects the individual's personality and attitudes. Remember that? We talked about the fact that we attribute people's behaviors to their personality and we disregard the situation. Well, collectivism, behavior reflects social norms and roles. You are responding to the social norms and roles because that's what's important. That's your priority. In our world, what's important is us. Their world, it's us. So that's pretty good. A pretty good description of individualism versus collectivism. And then to top it off, you got to love this. This figure 39.6, a child like no other. Americans' individualistic tendencies are reflected in their choices of names for their babies. And you see this graph starting out in the 1880s, moving forward to basically last year, I guess, 2020. And you see that the percentage of the 10 most common names is going down. So a name that you say, oh, well, Trevor was really popular in 1999 or something. A lot of kids named Trevor, and a name for a female, especially ones that you don't hear too much of, not Mary and John, that kind of name, but more Tiffany or something like that, becomes popular, becomes, I, in my former life as a child abuse and neglect investigator, I got involved with a child named Tatiana, which sounds like a Russian name. But at the time, there was a perfume that was very popular, smelled great, called Tatiana. So this little neonatal infant that I got involved with, a whole long story, but I still remember that child. It was on a Super Bowl Sunday that we're having court at St. John's Hospital in Springfield, Illinois, for the state to take custody of this kid because her parents were Jehovah's Witness and they would not allow the child to have a blood transfusion. So the doctors called us. I went to the hearing and we got custody of the child, gave permission to have the blood transfusion. The kid lived, may have lived without it, but it wasn't looking good. So, and as you know, you get a window of opportunity, especially when kids are really young like that. If they have some disability like a serious blood problem, then they're going to have organ damage and they may never recover from it. So it's a critical thing. It has to be done. It has to be done within that window of opportunity. So we rest assured that we took care of that child, and we made a lot of elders in that church mad because we did it. I think the parents were really young, like 18 and 19. They were happy that their child lived, of course, and they weren't so much into the religious dogma at the time. And the state of Illinois paid the hospital bill because we had custody of the child before we returned it to their parents. So, all right, well, that's what my overview of the chapter is. Now let's look at some questions here to finish out our time together. You know what, I forgot when we started. It's okay. Of course, we start off with all these questions, getting us aware of what trait means. Well, the whole first page is traits. And then even the next is traits and factors, which we all know. Let's look at this question. Personality factors are, this is question 12. Personality factors are best described as clusters of behavior tendencies that occur together. So put those clusters together and you have a personality. Now, here's another example of that reciprocal determinism. Look at question 19. Children respond to stress with different anxiety if they have a D, reactive autonomic nervous system. So some of us by nature, because of our biological nature and our neural pathways, we respond very quickly to external stimuli. And obviously, if there's stressful things in our life, we're going to respond to it. And if our, we talked about this when we talked about attachment. We are successfully, securely attached, then our physiological ability to deal with stress is greatly enhanced. And if we are not attached and we don't feel well about ourselves and in the world, then our autonomic system doesn't respond well to stress, and therefore we get more stressed. So you can see that the biological, physiological side of us does greatly influence our personality formation, because others in our life, in our social sphere, like our caregivers, are going to respond to us. And if we're, a nice child and we're always giggling and gooing and all that stuff, people like to hold us. People like to pass us around at a family outing or something. But if we're the kid that's crying and whining and we're not going to pass that kid around. And that's tough. Number 21, which of the following may shape personality, temperament, and behavioral style? Temperament is how you feel. Behavioral style is how you act. Those things are going to affect the people in your life, and those people in your life are going to affect you. So it is a mutual cause and effect relationship. They have their biopsychosocial, you have your biopsychosocial. Now looks like we're getting into big 5 issues: introversion, shyness, introversion, traits, personality inventory. All right, now we're on to MMPI. Number 30 is the issue I was talking about earlier, that the MMPI is empirically derived. So question 30 says, an empirically derived test is one that is developed by testing a pool of items and then selecting those that discriminate between groups. So you have these questions. I would rather be a librarian than a farmer. I've never disliked anybody in my life. Those questions, and certain groups answer it in one direction and other groups answer it in another. So we're trying to find traits that we can put together that are consistent with neuroticism and can separate us from other personality traits. So there's a bunch of MMPI questions. Oh, here's the question. 36 that I knew we'd come across. Which of the following statements would most likely appear on a lie scale? The MMPI has 3 lie scales in addition to the 10 other scales that they're measuring. And the answer is D, I never disliked anyone. Because if you're trying to show yourself as a good person, you might be inclined to say, yeah, that's true. But the lie scale is going to say, people who answer that question are lying for the most part. Everybody dislikes somebody sometime. And when you say a straight, generalized answer for everybody I've ever met, I've ever known, I've never disliked any of them. That's just not reality based. So if you're answering your questions on the MMPI, which is a subjective test, you're the one answering it, so you can answer it any way you want. But there are 3 life skills based on millions of MMPI profiles that have been looked at and then compared to the people who actually did take it. A lot of times we call these personality tests, we call them inventories. Actually, the MMPI, the I in MMPI is an inventory. Question 41, the big 5 trait dimensions were identified by means of self-report inventories. So that's different than empirically derived. And here we are talking about conscientiousness, emotional instability, neuroticism, openness, extroversion. So now we're getting to a bunch of descriptors having to do with the big 5. I placed another piece of information on Blackboard on the big 5. It's a little bit longer article describing the 5 personality factors. So if you want to look at that, it's the very last thing in Blackboard in 38 and 39, because I just added it this morning, because there's a lot of big 5 questions on here. And so there will be big 5 questions on the exam. I really think it's pretty straightforward. I don't think you have to overthink it too much. 63, Charles just lost his job after 30 years. This is likely to make him less happy. Well, happy's not on there. So less conscientious, less neurotic, less introverted, or less agreeable. Answer, less agreeable. He's not in the mood to be agreeable and happy. He just lost his job after 30 years. So a lot of these questions are along those lines. Personality traits. Question 74. Which personality emphasized that we learn many of our behaviors either through conditioning or by observing and imitating others, letting our mirror neuron pathways get it done for us? That's an easy question with an easy answer. A, social cognitive perspective. We learn by being social beings, watching others and interacting with others. And the only person that we're talking about is Albert Bandura, Mr. Bobo the Clown. Okay, so there's a bunch of questions about the social cognitive perspective. Then they kind of throw in this gene environmental interaction. It's the same thing. Nature nurtures, come on. Why bring up gene environment interactions? It's just, they don't even mention epigenetics, which is what it is, you know, our social environment acting upon our gene structure is epigenetics, but they don't even mention it. And then some of my favorite questions, biopsychosocial approach. They're in the late 80s here, 88, 87, 89. Then we're back to social cognitive type answers and questions, and separate. Now here's one I wanted you to think about. 98. In contemporary psychology, the self is described to be what? What is yourself? And the answer is the organizer of our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. Sounds a lot like Freud's ego, doesn't it? Since we've got ego over my shoulder, I can't figure out what my shoulder is. Ah, there we are. Ego. And then it's talking about the possible selves and spotlight effect and all that stuff. Number 104 is a definition. A sense of personal self-worth is called self-esteem. So how you feel about yourself, that's your self-esteem. And then there's a couple of questions about self-esteem. Self-efficacy, not a word we see very often. Term self-efficacy. Efficacy. Now I'm going to have a hard time pronouncing it. Efficacy. Efficacy. See, efficacy. Number 109, self-efficacy is our expectations about whether we will attempt and succeed in our new challenges. So it's kind of an anticipatory statement about our confidence in ourselves. I can do that. I'll try that. If I don't get it the first time, I'll get it the second or third time. So these are kind of introspective thoughts. And then it looks like we end up with self-serving bias, and yeah, a couple of questions on self-serving bias. So that's a review, kind of a thumbnail flyover review of these questions for Mod 39. I really didn't see any of them that were particularly confusing. Generally, as I say, when I find them, I take them out anyway. So, all right. Well, no class tomorrow. Don't show up. I'm not going to be there. So, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you on Thursday.